So welcome to our second session for the Australian Educational Podcast Conference. Some people were with us for the opening keynotes, others have just joined us now. So we're so delighted from Swinburne that we are hosting this podcast, the second of this podcast conference. And it is sponsored by the School of Social Sciences, Media, Film and Education, and also the Swinburne Adobe Creative Campus. My name's Narelle Lemon. I am going to be your host for this Thinking 1 hour session where we have 4 magnificent speakers. But before we introduce each other and go into our program, I would just like to respectfully acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and the elders past, present and emerging, and who are our traditional owners of the land on which Swinburne's Australian campuses are located. It's also the lands of which I am currently located, and I also acknowledge the lands of which you are all zooming in on today for this very exciting second session of our conference. So this session is called A Thinking. It's kind of a combination between a round table of what we would do face-to-face, but it's a virtual equivalent of each presenter will have 10 minutes and we will get to hear aspects about their work. It complements the abstracts and the audio that are provided online. And then we have 15 minutes of a chance to ask questions or to even pose one question and to think and bounce off each other with that. Again, we are very much encouraging the chat room to be used alongside the presentations for commentary, and so that our live presentations and chat all come together as a community. So I am delighted to welcome our first presenter, and let me just let people in from the room and get everything happening here. So I'm delighted that Jess is going to be our first presenter, and I'm going to hand over to you. I'm going to spotlight you so everyone can see your gorgeous face.
Yay, thank you so much. It is almost 8:30 in the morning here in Copenhagen, so I'm doing well. I've got coffee. It's going to be great. So thank you so much for having me. I'm Jess Perrium. I'm an assistant professor at the IT University of Copenhagen, which is one of Denmark's youngest universities. And we specialize in teaching and research in computer science, digital design, and technology in society. So I'm a digital sociologist, and I've had a previous life as a radio producer in Australia. So I did darken the doors of ABC Perth and ABC Central West in New South Wales about 10 or 15 years ago. This morning, I'm going to talk about how we developed a talk radio format as a teaching method on one of our units on the MSc Digital Innovation Management program. And the unit is called Navigating Complexity, Mapping, Visualization, and Decision-Making, which is a bit of a mouthful, so we usually call it Navcom. And Navcom Radio is a 2-hour talk radio show which we broadcast over Zoom. And I'll take a few moments to explain how it works before discussing what a soft program classroom even is and how it can be considered one. So Navcom Radio is a show that helps support a range of other teaching and learning activities on the course. The course itself introduces our master's students from a range of backgrounds to science and technology studies theory, and it helps them analyze complexity within society, taking a specific look at technology. They also learn digital research methods to help them analyze social media data as part of their final assessment project. So there's a lot going on for our students across the week in terms of learning activities. And we started Navcom Radio last year during the pandemic out of necessity. The course actually has 2 scheduled lectures each week, and we had to have one of those lectures online due to building capacity issues. At that point in time, Denmark was actually not in lockdown, so we were able to meet together, but under reduced building capacity. And we decided that rather than transpose the lecture format online, we wanted to play with something different. And this is a picture from last year's season. So there's my colleague Baki in the background looking like a DJ, and then my other colleagues Lena and Marissa, and our two TAs, Christopher and Aska, doing the production work there. And so That's Something Different was a talk radio show. And I'm talking to you from the studio that we use, and it's a podcast studio that is housed in offices that used to belong to Denmark's radio, so the equivalent of the ABC or the BBC. They live just next door to us. So our aim was to have 2 or 3 lecturers from our 5-person teaching team in conversation about the week's course content. And it's been a really nice way to collaborate as teachers. And it's also been a way for our students to engage with the syllabus in a way that demystifies the text. We place an emphasis on setting the texts in the real world and within everyday contexts. And most of the team, except for me, I was the newbie, most of us had been teaching the syllabus for a few years. So it allowed them to really play with the delivery of teaching materials a little bit more. And it's important to note a few things about Navcom Radio. It's not a podcast in its true sense of the form. It's a live radio show. And that key distinction is that, you know, a podcast can be very much asynchronous because we record it ahead of time, unless you're kind of there with your audience doing a live recording. But we make it in the moment. We encourage students to ask us questions on chat. We've been wanting them to kind of unmute themselves and ask us in person for a long time, but they haven't bitten on that yet. We're hopeful. But this allows us to interact with our audience of students in really different ways. And I think it's important to note at this point in time that our students listen in many different ways. So we have an auditorium open on campus so they can listen communally. They can listen on their way into the office. They can listen over breakfast because our show this year starts at 8 a.m. So it's a bit early for them. But I just wanted to share what our students think. And this is a quote from one of our students last year. They posted this comment on LinkedIn, actually, of all places. But this student is actually one of our teaching assistant producers this year, and he has a background in information sciences. So he's able to help make the program audio make more sense to students after the show is over. So he adds metadata to the timestamps in the audio. So when the episodes are added to our Moodle page, students can think, oh, I heard something about this particular text. Where in the audio is it? So they don't have to trawl through 2 hours of audio if they want to use it as a revision text. And then, so I want to spend a few moments just talking about soft programmed versus hard programmed online teaching. So Horst and Ingerslew talk about the traditional auditorium setting as being a hard programmed classroom, as there are kind of limited ways of using that space to do teaching and that kind of thing. So they consider a physical soft programmed classroom as being a space that is more flexible and allowing for a range of teaching activities to take place. And we consider talk radio to be a fairly soft programmed format because it's flexible enough for students to set the agenda according to where their curiosity leads them or where they feel they need a bit of clarification. So we always do a bit of a rundown and a plan for the show, but sometimes we don't stick to it. We're fairly good at sticking to it, but we're happy to be flexible enough to say, you know, if students really want to have a conversation about devising a research question, we recognize that that's important to them in the moment and we respond to it that way. So it's actually just really good in that sense to be able to respond to students in that way. So we did our first season last year. We're currently in our second season. Now we broadcast live on Tuesday mornings from 8 till 10. And I think what's been really good about doing a second season is that we've had a whole year to think about improving the format so students can get even more out of it. We've included a hypothetical group project segment where us as a group of teachers do a project on air alongside the project that students are doing across the entire term. And it's it is good fun, and it's also just I think students realize how terrible teachers are as students. But yeah, we get feedback from our TAs and students live in the moment about our harebrained scheme to do a similar project to what they're doing across the term. We've also been able to do pre-recorded interviews with some of the authors that appear on our syllabus. And I think that's just a nice chance that we don't normally get to have to hear voices of the people who have actually written the things, and for our students to actually realize that they're real people and not just a citation. And as I mentioned before, we have better metadata and care for our audio assets this time around. Thank you. We also have merchandise. We make stickers every year because we love building that sense of community through material objects. But I'm gonna leave it there.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jess. That was marvelous. Yes, applause, claps. Fabulous, fabulous. So inspiring, so inspiring. We have to hold on to our questions right into the end. So for those that are bursting, feel free to post them in the chat or write them down so we don't forget. And I am now so delighted to move to our next international guest. And Joseph is joining us from Edinburgh. Also, good morning. And we'll throw it over to you. So I will spotlight you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I feel like I'm being a little bit deceptive. I'm actually based in the United States, in Virginia, but I am also working in Edinburgh remotely as well. So it is, because Jess updated on her time, it is actually 2:32 a.m. in Virginia, and my son decided to come down and see what I was doing, which was one of those things. So my name is Dr. Joe Arton. I'm an academic developer at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm based at the Institute for Academic Development. And Jess, that was a wonderful presentation. I'm not sure how I'm going to follow this now. My current role is that I've just recently moved on from being the editor of Teaching Matters, which is the University of Edinburgh's blog, website, multimedia kind of presence for all things to do with teaching and learning. And I was very fortunate coming into this role that Teaching Matters already had a pretty robust international reputation. It was in really good shape, and it was all really nicely primed for me to break it. So that was good. And I just wanted to talk briefly about why I fell in love with audio and why I feel so passionately about this topic, and why I was so delighted to be invited here is that when I was a very little boy, I had great trouble sleeping, much like my own son now. And I had trouble falling asleep, and I had trouble staying asleep. And one of the tactics that I did is that I would listen to the radio. I would listen to the shipping forecast off the BBC, or I would listen to the World Service, or sometimes my preferred choice was some absolutely horrific call-in radio show in London, where I was based, where you get all sorts of weirdos calling in the middle of the night. And I found this very calming. And when my own kids were born, I just finished my PhD, and I was home with them, and they also had trouble falling asleep and had trouble staying asleep. And podcasting, as this is when I came across podcasting. And my PhD, I spent a lot of time on sociolinguistics and sound and film. And I found that this was my way of feeding my curiosity in the middle of the night without having to turn on a screen. And as Nicholas Thomas, who's the director of the Haddon Museum in Cambridge, the Anthropology Museum, says curiosity builds community, and that these two words are not naturally synonymous, but they help encourage, one helps build and lays the groundwork for the other. And this is very much really the story of the podcast that we were doing at the University of Edinburgh. So fast forward, it's December 2020. And we were noticing a worrying trend. The assistant editor of Teaching Matters Josephine Boucher, who's a PhD student in the Department of Sociology at the university, and I were noticing that our engagement on our blogs was really dropping off a cliff. At the same time, I just project managed and curated another site called the Edinburgh Hybrid Teaching Exchange, which was all very nice and shiny, but not many people were coming to the site. And this engagement data was quite troubling, because this was also at a time when the university was transitioning from a face-to-face on-campus experience to a hybrid and digital learning and teaching environment. And if there was ever a time for the strategic importance of a place like the Institute for Academic Development, it was then. And so never let a crisis go to waste, as many politicians have done. I realized this was the time to innovate, but innovate in a way that was low risk and low exposure to the university, but innovate in a way that, you know, we could measure something and maybe find some sort of unintended sort of consequences and learning from that. So I had this idea that what about if we could use podcasts and use sound and use audio to create the same experience that we had worked on the blog, where we would co-create content with academics and professional staff across the 21 different schools and create a frictionless process and workflow, so that the ideas and best practice and community of practice could be shared in different mediums. And maybe to see if we could capture those moments in the flow of someone's day where they were doing the washing up, doing the laundry, going for a walk when Boris Johnson's allowed us to go for an hour walk each day. Could we capture those moments to see if we could do some sort of intervention in academic and professional development that could really help support this transition to this really quite frightening and new sort of way of working and learning? And the way that we did that is that we decided that, you know, we had no longer had access to our podcasting studio that we had at the University of Edinburgh. That was behind locked doors. But what we did have was a technology that we're all sitting in front of right now. We had sound recording equipment, we had editing software, we had everything at our fingertips. And the idea was to kind of build this experience into what was familiar for academic staff and professional staff, introduce something new, but ideally introduce something that was valuable and useful for them as well. And so we developed a way of reaching out to academics and say, we understand you don't have a lot of time to write a blog post for us about some of the innovation and experimentation that you're doing, but do you have time to have a chat for an hour? We'll record it and we'll take care of the rest. And surprisingly, they said yes. And one of the examples that I shared on this was this strategic problem that we were having at the university, where there was deteriorating student mental health around online engagement. And my colleague, Dr. Catherine Bovell, also my boss at the Institute for Academic Development, she worked with me by gathering a really diverse group of academic staff and students and professional services. And we got them all together in a room and we asked them to kind of engage in the messiness and the difficult unanswered questions, which really were sort of becoming quite sort of endemic in working in a complex educational environment when it's going through such a difficult transformation. And as a result of that, we also decided that we would take care of the post-production, we would take care of the pre-production, and we would create an environment where people could just talk, and that we would bring in storytelling techniques, we would bring in sound effects, we would bring in music, and we would create this polished, beautiful product that we could share with them as a proof of concept, that we could help build some social proof and some momentum for this mode of academic engagement. And I was very happy to say that this kind of paid off. And we did this on a next to nothing budget. I would like to say we were under-resourced. We had no resource. We were recording transitions under duvets in order to be able to make a better sound quality. We used every single open source, GDPR compliant resource out there. We had to upskill a bunch of people on how to use technology. And this was very much sellotape, blue tack, kind of guerrilla style audio production. But it worked and it paid off. And within the 10 months we have been able to capture the insights and voices of 16 of the 21 different schools that we have represented at the University of Edinburgh. And the podcast was actually submitted as part of our quality assurance review with the Scottish Government, and was singled out by the Scottish Government as an example of why there was such high quality teaching at the University of Edinburgh. But more importantly, we were able to build a community of practice, the social proof, and an evidence base for the work that I've transitioned to, which is curriculum transformation. And we've been able to tackle subjects that I wasn't particularly excited about, which was, you know, the argument around summative and formative assessments. But through the process of editing these series is that I realized what a sexy and exciting subject this is. And we've been able to collaborate with the Student Association on their student-led teaching awards, which is an entirely student-decided award system offered at the University of Edinburgh. And we've been able to capture the voices of the nominees, and digging into what I described in my proposal. This is the social silences, those voices that are not necessarily heard in these conversations. And giving space for open-ended conversations was able to kind of identify the innovation, identify the experimentation in this space. So circling back, I would say that this is, I'm no longer doing the podcast, no longer producing the podcast. Thankfully, I made the case that we've been able to actually create a dedicated role for this. And we now have a wonderful undergraduate intern called Eric Burgo, who has done absolute wonders since taking over. And I would say that it is one of the more successful things that we've done for academic and faculty development. And I think that it represents a really promising model for engaging immersive, multimodal forms of professional development within this space. So I think I'm about out of time, but thank you so much, Narelle.
Beautiful. Thank you, Joe. Such wonderful insights. I'm just going to remove the spotlight from you. And I am now going to welcome Erica to the floor, and I'm just going to find you to spotlight you. There we go. Thanks, Erica.
Hi, it is great to be here, and I'm also in the US, so I'm trying to make this full screen. Sorry, there we go, present. Okay, I'm also in the US, so it's 2 something in the morning. So forgive my my brain, whatever that might do during this time. So today I wanted to share, and gosh, it's hard to follow up what we've started with already here. This has been wonderful content, but a podcast assignment that kind of also grew out of necessity, a phrase that I've heard several times already at the conference, and really where my interest in including podcasting as an assignment came from. So this is a quote by Maya Angelou that I really like. There's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. And one of the things I've just really learned to appreciate working with students is that they don't think necessarily that the story inside of them is important. And so it takes them a minute to get there, to like really go, oh my, like, wow, I really need to share this. I need to share this with the world. So again, my name is Erica Walker. I'm in the Department of Graphic Communications at Clemson University, which is in South Carolina. And my background is that I'm a filmmaker. So although I've always recognized the importance of how much audio can shape a story, anyone who has a current favorite TV show knows that when those first notes of the intro song on your TV show come on, you are like, this is it. Or you also know that anytime a bad character steps on screen, that sound is going to shift. So I've always been super aware of how important clean, good, gorgeous impactful audio is, I did come from a visual storytelling background, and that's my class is about half photography and half video currently. But this assignment really came out of necessity. Like I said, all of a sudden COVID happened. In South Carolina, we were asked to provide every which way, and students, it was it was student choice and not professor choice. And so we had students that needed all sorts of different ins and outs of the classroom, access to equipment or not, having to figure out how to do things at home without a studio, which is where we normally work. And so I moved from this kind of team teaching, storytelling, documentary filmmaking project prior to COVID to an audio storytelling project that provided this additional flexibility for my students, because even these little things are really quite excellent headphones and microphones as needed. So you don't necessarily need, I think Joseph was just saying, underneath blankets or whatever. So the mother of necessity has been COVID for us. So one of the big things I needed to do is move my students' mindset from this idea of relying on visuals. So how could they tell a story that was important without relying on these big flashy screen and quick edits, all this fun visual stuff? How could they hone in on that story and really make it powerful with nothing but the audio to rely on? So this assignment really mixed together some of my favorite things about being in a classroom with students. Storytelling is always at the center of everything I try to teach students. A great technical project is nothing but a great technical project. Without that story behind it, why'd you choose it? Who's in front of the camera? Who's telling the story? What are you trying to convey? And my students are actually in the College of Business, and so storytelling is not something necessarily that they think of, even though they're doing visual content. They're thinking more on the technical end. So I want to take this technical piece, recording, mixing, using Adobe Audition, and combine it with this storytelling piece. And in order to do that, I had to teach interviewing skills. And the good news is I found that as a documentary filmmaker, interviewing skills don't change a lot between interviewing for podcasts versus interviewing for a documentary. You're still in charge of your interview. You still have to guide somebody through what you want. You still have to shape your questions. You still need to get a clean, concise response, meaning you have to sometimes ask a question multiple times to get what you're looking for. So all of that stuff conveyed really beautifully for me and didn't push me too far out of my knowledge area or my comfort zone. And then I also am a big proponent of using reflection with students, giving them a chance to respond. What did I learn? What would I do differently? What was the hardest thing that I had to overcome in this? And why was that the hardest thing? Because I think it's just so important for them to have that moment where run. Next assignment, turn it in. Maybe I get some feedback. Maybe I just get a grade. I wanted them to take a minute to really think about what they had accomplished and why they had done that. So just a couple really quick quotes from students. The thing that they seem to find most surprising, I've now done this for 3 semesters, is how complex writing the good questions are, and how you can't just not research anything and walk into a room, set down a camera or a microphone. Sorry, that's the midnight words. Set down a microphone and just talk. It doesn't work that way. You have to prepare and you have to think about those questions and you have to order them with a lot of thought involved. And this one I really liked. I think they might have listened to my lecture, my recorded lecture right before they filled out the reflection. But this is definitely something I say. You should never ask a question unless you have a good feel for the response you're going to get, because you can't tell a story unless you know the idea of what sort of pieces are going to come together. It doesn't mean you're putting words in people's mouths when you interview them, but it does mean that you are well prepared and you ask the question to get the type of response that is going to play into the overall final story that is going to emerge from your piece. So I think that that's about it. Oh, I do have a minute or two left. So one thing I did want to add is that I'm also a qualitative researcher. And so I use documentary filmmaking and interviewing a lot for both my data and for the presentation of my data, which is why I've loved some of the presentations so far, this idea that that podcasting can be a piece of this in a very formal and acceptable way, even within the confines of traditional academia. So I really appreciate all of that information and the conversations about how to use transcriptions. And that is not something I have my students using, although the smart ones would do kind of an auto transcribe, which Adobe is building into their tools now in wonderful ways. And then that allows you to do much quicker editing if you can find those pieces without having to, listen through each time and do markers and all of that. So I love this conference specifically. This is my first time attending, but the idea of how podcasting can become an integral piece across all of my interests, similar to what Abby was saying earlier, how it can kind of pull all of those together. So thank you so much. And I look forward to the last presentation in this group and some of the questions the audience comes up with. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Erica. Thank you. And we love the Midnight Brain. It is good. We can all resonate with it so much. I'm just going to stop spotlighting you, and I'm going to spotlight Liz. There we are.
Thanks, Narelle.
Beautiful.
I don't have to call me beautiful, but it helps. We'll take that. Hello, friends. I hope you can see this okay, and I'm just going to start my stopwatch too. My midnight people, the middle of the night, I have so much respect for you. Here it's bath and bedtime. So if you hear what's going on in bath and bedtime, I promise there's an adult involved. I can't promise much more, but there is an adult involved, I promise. So thank you very much for staying up or staying late. I really appreciate it. This course, this chat is about how you would teach podcasting in an online-only asynchronous environment. And even though, as the other speakers have talked about, we've all had COVID interrupt us, is that what we'd say? We've all been forced online in some ways. This was actually slated to be completely online in the before times, partly while I was on maternity leave and I wasn't there to argue, but also because it's one of those things that, as we know, universities are exploring, different modes of delivery and stuff. And I have delivered solely online before. I was working for the Australian version of Open University once upon a time, so I do have some experience with this type of stuff. Plus, what will make sense in a minute is this comes out of a music and sound degree, and if something for all of what we do had to be online, then it kind of makes sense to put making things like podcasting online, given that it's born digital, for want of a better description. The translation process was less. So just to give you a bit of an explanation, this course that I'm talking about, which is just called podcasting, it's had a few versions. It was initially called Singing and Vocality, which was not my title and was not what it was ever about, but there's a long version around that. Then it was just called Vocality, about the voice. All the way through I was saying, no, this is about podcasting. Let's make this about podcasting. So finally it is just called that. And it lives within a BA in Music and Sound in the School of Communications in a Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. So to give you a sense, this is for second year music and sound students, and it is completely asynchronous, online only. Now I say that just noting that there were optional Zoom sessions for those that wanted to drop in. Very few ever did, but they always said they wanted that. So I was here, as we know. Sometimes you've got to be here for them to ignore you, bless. a few of the things that I decided, I said, well, if I'm going to make this, I'm going to have a format, I'm going to make a weekly lecture podcast as the main focus, as the main sort of thing, that the event that's going to happen every week. I posted this to Canvas, our LMS, but also on SoundCloud. I included full transcripts and texts with descriptions, further audio examples on Canvas. And I was really keen to not just have this be a recorded lecture, so not just have a lecture as I normally would give it, just with the audio. I wanted to make an actual podcast. So it was edited, it made sense without images. It wasn't, as you might see here or click on later, it had to make sense without images. It included clips of podcasts and audio only materials, some of what Siobhan was talking about too, that where I could add that extra colour and audio description and illustration, but demonstration, I did that too. I tried to talk directly to students one-on-one. And I would do that. I would talk about where you are. I would say, take me out for a walk, go and do something else, but also try and have that sense of togetherness. I even made a theme tune because I thought, why not? Let's have a theme tune. Got to keep myself amused apart from anything else. So it kind of looked a little bit like this. On Canvas, you would have this kind of Canvas layout that you're probably used to if you use that kind of thing. But I would also live on SoundCloud. I'd like to share with you bits and pieces, but we're still working out with the university what I'm allowed to share and what I'm not, whether or not it should live behind a wall or not. And that's one of those tricky things that we can work out. As we know, university environments love innovation, but they also love their own IP, and we've got to meet somewhere in the middle there. So I'm happy to send people stuff, but I can't broadcast exactly what I had. The big thing I wanted to think about was my content, how to be different in the market, acknowledging that there's already out there so many free online only podcasting courses, and Siobhan's Power of Podcasting was mentioned before. And once Siobhan's done it, I mean, what are the rest of us going to do? Even my own university had a free open course called Introduction to Podcasting. So I thought, well, I can't be in competition. I'm not going to be in competition. What can I do that is not being done? How can I value add? And I very, not just shamelessly, but with a lot of love, would suggest that my students followed up on what other people might call my competition, so to build their suite of what's around. So I was also acknowledging what had been published elsewhere or not, and acknowledging what they did or didn't know or care about podcasting. It was really interesting from music and sound industry perspective, from music and sound students. A lot of them, they'd heard a bit about radio, that thing that, they might want to get played on and pretend that they're cool and they don't care. But did they know about podcasting? If they did, what did they know? And often it wasn't very much at all. So a big part of my sell still is to say, this is what it is. This is where there are some avenues for you. It sometimes would be cynical and say, hey, you could make some dosh out of this, being a producer or being someone that knows about sound. You could actually, there's opportunity for you while you're trying to write a hit record, but also say, but beyond that, this is a thing on its own. And you should think about it. It is the future, but it's also the past. It's all together, So sorry, I sound like Oprah saying it's the future and the past, but you know what I mean, to say that this is a real legitimate option for you as music and sound people. So how to be different in the market for me was to have an Australian focus in terms of examples and industry insight, because what's around is still very US, UK focused. There's nothing wrong with that, but it is. Have as many contemporary examples and current insight as I possibly could, including very commercial things and very messy things. So I tried to have the two extremes. I really went in and said, well, what are the people listening to? Not just Serial, although we love it, actually what are most people listening to? Sometimes as vile and as commercial as it was. Let's understand why. Talk about a variety of genres and perspectives. So again, the scholarship in particular, with respect to the amazing scholars who do this work, so far there is sort of a focus on true crime and high-end docos, the Serial scholarship that we know about. So to say, well, what else is out there? And particularly in Australia, we're a strange little rock at the end of the world that's got some interesting and quite unusual listening habits. And to acknowledge that YouTube, still as weird as it is where a lot of people listen. So that big study that came out of Canberra University, I think it was last year, that said YouTube is the place. So we've got to acknowledge that. We've got to think, well, what do we do about that? Audio only on a visual outlet. Just to give you, these are a couple of very brief examples. Oh, it's kicking off down there. I don't know if you can hear that. Sorry about that. I spoke to people like and invited people like Miss Warhurst to give me some insight, to do some interviews for me. So we featured some of her work and she gave me some content for my students. I also tried to take from a popular music and a music industry perspective, well, what does music mean in podcasting? And particularly in Australia, it's just a bit too hard. It's way too hard, copyright too hard. What do we do? Too hard. But if you think about it, there's lots of opportunity. So we tackled all of that. We went there. We had a whole section, is Spotify evil? And we argued it out, you know, we're still not sure. The people that I spoke to too, I tried to have a variety of people of different ages, stages and ability. This guy, Mike, he likes just to be known as Radio Mike, but he's a podcaster for very commercial podcasts in Australia. He looks after Hamish and Andy, all of Will Anderson's imaginary radio programs, The Chaser, M. Russiano, does all of that stuff. He's only 25. He's only just out of uni himself. And when I approached him, he was like, no, I don't think you know that I'm not a real person. I'm not young. I said, no, that's exactly what I want. I want somebody my students can relate to. I want somebody who they can recognise. Another bloke, Mike Williams, who was a former student many years ago, who now works at the ABC, and then a friend and colleague, Siobhan Hunt, who does a lot of work sort of in niche genre podcasting. So you might know her from Kindling and that kind of targeted, very specific world of podcasting. And they all gave me those industry insights that I wanted, that specific stuff that wasn't around elsewhere. The other thing I did was try and put in examples from my own podcasting practice. And that importantly was mistakes. I think it's really hard when you're teaching people, how do you give examples of works in progress? How do you get people to hand them over? I asked, they wouldn't, why would they? But I had to be doing it myself in order to give some of my own mistakes. I'm happy to share some of those if you're interested. But one in particular is a parenting podcast I do called Music Mothers and Others, where we can't afford mechanical copyright, but we do have publishing. So I just get the kids to sing stuff I want to talk about. It's great. 2 birds, 1 stone. Excellent. I can claim them on my tax. So good. Just to zip through then, I know that I don't have long to go. My assessment was a mixture of analysis and creating and editing. And it came together all with this thing called Student Shorts, which I do in collaboration with the radio station here, 2SER. It's had a mixture of results for a few reasons, which I'm happy to talk about later. But it's a bit like Joseph said, money, honey, where is the resources? And I'm one little duck. Students love the content and pods, but they hated being online. I do too in lots of ways. But the happy news is some of the best work I've ever heard and some of the best engagement, because they can't just wait for me to play a thing. They actually have to listen. And it was really good because they don't normally do that. In terms of what should I change? Well, the big dilemma is, do we go live? And if so, how? Do we go hybrid? Should all lectures be on demand as podcasts? And for me, if the uni won't let me go back, which it looks like it won't at the moment, blah, blah, COVID money, whatever it is, I'm only going to do recorded lectures now as podcasts. There's no need to have a talking head like this. You don't need to see my face and my awkward PowerPoint. I'm only doing them, and I'm in the middle of doing that at the moment for a huge first-year comms course. It's got nothing to do about podcasting, but they like it because, again, we can say it's a lecture on the go. You can go for a walk, take me somewhere else, give your eyes a break. So that's it. That's me. Thanks for listening. Appreciate it.
Fabulous, fabulous. Thank you. I'm going to spotlight all our guests and presenters. So we have you together, which is beautiful. There we go. Wonderful. So we've got about 15 minutes or so to chat, discuss, open up questions. I want to ask a question myself before we open up to the floor, but that will also give opportunity for guests here in this session to perhaps post your question in the chat as well, if you feel that that's how you would like to do it. I felt this amazing sense of passion from all 4 of you as you talked about your podcast, your podcasting, engaging with students, colleagues, industry. And I just love that. And it's something that I think for me really stands out with those who do podcast and our podcasting. And it's quite refreshing. And I'm wondering how is this passion received by others who you're working with, who perhaps haven't engaged with this medium, might not even engage personally at all, or haven't even thought about it in that space of learning and teaching. I wonder if any of you, all of you, would like to respond.
I'm happy to, but if somebody else probably has some much more exciting things to say, but I'll happily, I'll start. So it's interesting that you pointed out, Narelle, about passion, and it's like, in the kind of work that I do is that I don't do a lot of student-facing work, and a lot of the things is that I produce things and they go out into the ether, and then I try and measure it. It's not a very emotionally rewarding experience sometimes, but actually the key to this was actually putting my emotion into this. Academic development, as you know, big surprise, is not the most sexy, emotionally engaging part of but it's critical. And I found that there was an intimacy to the podcast. There was an opportunity for me to bring in, you know, my previous life of teaching documentary film, of teaching film, of doing storytelling, bringing in some emotional arc into some of the work that I was doing. And it was an opportunity to be creative and passionate about the work, and also you know, take something that wouldn't on the surface appear to be a particularly emotional topic. Honestly, like, should we do summative examinations or large scale lectures? But getting people in a room who care about this, who care deeply about this, getting them a chance to have an open-ended conversation, and with some really, you know, well-designed interview questions, can actually tease out and kind of surface some of the emotional and the importance of some of these topics. And actually it was actually showing how much people cared, really helped kind of build some of that social proof of the effectiveness of this medium for culture change. And actually also, I think there's, you know, one of the lessons that I took that I love about podcasting is that it allows you to do that practice within psychology and therapeutic spaces of deep listening. And I think that which you don't necessarily get in a sort of in a synchronous lecture, because there's lots of visual distraction. And I love what the other presenters were saying about, you know, not relying on slides, not relying on flashy visuals, not relying on those things, and actually just listening and taking the time to listen. And I think that can build empathy. But it was really interesting when you say passion for it, because I think that when you can build that emotional connection to something, when you can get an emotional response to it, you know, I mean, the literature says you get a deeper learning, you get, you know, but, you know, I mean, that's research and I don't really pay attention to that anyway. So.
Erica, you were before me, I think.
Oh, Erica, you owe us a drink. You're muted.
Got it. Thank you. I actually was just going to add to what Joseph said, that what is really exciting being student facing is that they don't think of themselves as storytellers or podcasters. And then they see, oh my, like, look at what I created. It sounds professional. It sounds good. I could put it up against these podcasts that I might listen to at home. And they, in doing so, they also are getting a chance to tell someone else's story. I love that some of the things that Narelle has said is, you know, hey, let's recognize that this land was owned by somebody before us, and just that opportunity to stop long enough and listen to someone else's story is what human connection is all about. So,
I have to say, one of the passions I have, I mean, I'm very lucky to have this job, because I kind of feel like passion's infectious. If I don't love it, then my students won't love it. And the hard thing about teaching online before was I didn't do anything with audio. So to me, you can't contain how excited I am, and that's fine. Like, I just lent right into that. But what I find is interesting, particularly around the genres and the different types of things with podcasting, is it's so accessible no matter what happens. So when I was doing the version of this course, you know, face-to-face in the before times, I would go into the big studio after they've just done their last course on, you know, having 5.1 sound and the most beautiful speakers, lovely environment. And I would give them literally $2 headphones from the reject shop. And I would say, now make it sound good with this. No, forget about it. I want you in MP3 and I want you to make it sound good with this, because if it sounds good with this, which is how most people are listening, with all the other noise going on, with everything else going on in the background, if you can get their attention with that, then you'll work anywhere. And it's funny to have little minds explode. It's funny to have my colleagues go, who is that freak and what's going on? But to me, that's the challenge. Plus, it's also to me saying, all right, well, you can learn one end somewhere else. This is the end I occupy, you know what I mean? And that diversity exists in industry too, doesn't it? You know, certainly in Australia, we know it's Hamish and Andy up the top, then it's, you know, it's the Bluey girls with terrible sound but wonderful content and everything in between, you know? So that's what I really love about it. And I hope that you know, my students can find their place in it too, just in the diversity of the place.
Yeah. I really love the question about passion and enthusiasm, because I think that's what's got us so far as a team, and it's such a team effort. And if one of us wasn't having fun, then we probably wouldn't do it next year. But we have so much fun, and I think that fun is infectious to the students. And we also, I liked that there was a question earlier in the chat about communities of practice, and I feel like podcasting and doing audio formats is really about developing a community of practice. And I mean, and also I kind of share what Liz is saying, you kind of occupy your own kind of corner of teaching, which is you can really make it your own. I got cornered in the office kitchen yesterday being like, oh my gosh, you're the podcast lady. And I'm like, am I that person in the institution?
That's me too, although I'm not a lady, but yes.
me either. But I think we did a lot of training, and I'm such a hoarder that I still had some of my training books from ABC local radio back a long time ago. So actually I was just sharing bits and pieces about, you know, what does a good interview look like? What does producing a good show look like from these perspectives that are very relatable, and actually teaching lecturers and teaching staff how to be radio presenters, and then teaching your teaching assistants or tutors how to be radio producers is quite fun. It's been really good and exciting for me to see everybody grow in their confidence. It's just, it's amazing. It's so rewarding.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. We've got a really gorgeous question from Corey in the comment, and she asked, when listening back or reflecting upon your own podcast, do you notice any elements of style that particularly distinguish the podcast from visual learning?
To be honest, if I'm talking about this course, but also what I'm doing now with the big comms course that I've just snuck podcasting into, I feel like I can be a bit more adventurous. I'm not so hung up on how I have to look, how my visuals have to look. I can get into ideas a bit more, and I can illustrate, you know, with the way people, I mean, I'm a sound person, I'm a music person, I prefer to lean in with my ears. Well, I'm mangling Siobhan's words again, but you know what I mean, like to really, that's where I'm most comfortable. And so I find that I can be a different type of version of myself. I find that I can really lean into that, whereas the visual is a little bit different. And maybe it's also too because, you know, just my age and stage and stature, you know, I was 5'1", short, dark-haired, glasses, fat girl, you know, that always distracts in a different way. Whereas when I'm talking, I'm just a voice. So I can just get over that and get on with delivering the material I need to deliver. So I actually find it really freeing, if that might be a bit selfish, but I do.
Yeah, really interesting point. Erica.
I was just going to add, Liz really covered that well. I think that it strips all of the bells and whistles out. And so you are down to just the sound, only one sense. And when you have in your headphones and you're using noise reduction, I mean, you are in with that voice. And so it's very personal, and it doesn't have all of the fancy, like quick edits and fun fonts and 3 cameras all mixed together. And so it strips you down to your bare story, which I think is really exciting.
Yeah, just building on both Liz and Erica, there's a democratizing process to this, and also I've because we start with, because I start with video and then I strip out the audio, is that often I'll watch something, I'll sit in and do some sort of light producing during the recording, and I'll miss something because I'm distracted by, you know, those 1,000 points of visual communication that I'm being distracted by. Or I say, gosh, that's quite annoying what they said about this. And I'm thinking that I wouldn't say that, obviously I want to keep my job. And I'd be like, oh, it doesn't sound very good. And then I'll listen back to it and I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I missed that. That's so interesting. And oh my gosh, that was quite a tough experience. But there's a lot of information on a video that we don't think about. And what's really interesting about stripping it away to that simplicity is that listening to the words and that you don't even get from a transcript. There's something magical, and I hate to use that word because it implies that there's like no labor behind it or something or whatever, but it's like there is something magical and there's an essence to it that you get that I find very hard. You're probably better at talking about this stuff than me, but I find it very hard to articulate in words, ironically, even though it's an audio medium, but I find it hard to articulate the magic and the specialness of this. But there's something about capturing the things that you miss. Also, I sometimes have a very hard time reading facial cues because of various different developmental challenges that I have. So I'm not always good at reading faces, and often I'm like, are you mad at me? And then I'm like, but if I can just listen to it, I'm like, oh yeah, okay, no, I get what you're saying. And you know, this is a family business, the ASD. So this is something I really believe in, the power of audio for really as a communication tool. I think it can be extremely effective for neurodiversity, and I think that there is a lot there. So yeah.
I think in terms of, because we have a radio show alongside a weekly lecture format, we can really see a difference between the expectations that students bring to both of those learning events. So I'm currently course managing this unit, so I get all of the requests from students being like, can we have the slides ahead of time so we can take notes and all of that kind of thing, and I have to be that terrible person who is like, no, because I can't account for the working practices of my colleagues, and that kind of thing. Whereas the radio show, we kind of have a bit of a serving suggestion at the start of the term to be all like, this is how you can use it. And also you know, it kind of strips away all those visual elements, which I think it can be quite distracting, because we've gotten used to this convention of, if you're going to stand up and do a lecture, you need to have these nice slides with all the helpful words on them. Yeah, so I like the simplicity.
Can I just add one thing super quickly too? It's the elephant in the room, but the one thing I would say though is that I feel sometimes that universities in particular have a feeling we can just do that, just turn it on. But to do it well is hard. It requires editing, it requires planning much more than it ever did to talk live. I still write a script, I still have to plan and remove and re-edit. And also you've got, if it's democratizing in one way, that's true, but it's also not in the other way. So I live in quite close quarters, I have quite small children. Do I record at times? Do I pretend they're not there? Do I try and pull them out? I've done both. Sometimes I'll just say to people, you can hear the bath in the background, and that is my life. That is what's happening now. There are kids in the bath. And you make yourself vulnerable in that way. Do you want your students to know that or not? They're never going to know that on your PowerPoint, you know, but what do? Do you wait? Do you not? You know what I mean? So it does present different challenges as well. Some people would say that's humanizing. Other people would say that's polarizing. I'm not really sure what the answer is.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's amazing how you all kind of got this two-pronged perspective of the visual versus the audio, and all quite unique, you know, in your approach to audio. So so thank you so much for sharing. That definitely answers my question in a really sort of broad sense. I wonder if I can ask, just as we've got a couple of minutes and the next session is transitioning in, but I think those joining us will still be interested as well. We've got a really great question about from Ruth, who says, I'm a PhD researcher contemplating creating a pod to illustrate some of my work. Any tips to how to go about it? And I suppose I'm also going to ask it in terms of scholarship of teaching and learning practice, and thinking about about that, and acknowledging scholarship of learning and teaching also as a form of research. It sits in that research framework. It's not separate, although there can be debates within higher ed and understanding where that fits. So as scholars, I wonder, have you got any insights in regards to that, or thoughts?
So I'll jump in super quick. I wanted to say to that question, be sure that you are thinking of your audience and how you can get it in front of them. If you forget that piece and you do all this great work, it does nothing if you can't get it in front of your audience. So plan from the beginning. That piece of it would be, I think, my most crucial advice.
Everything Erica said, basically I'm going to say in a bit more rubbish. You have to think about this as a project. I would say backwards design thinking is a really nice way to start with this. Thinking about, as you're thinking about what your end product is, I think it's very much thinking about workflow design. It's the nuts and bolts of this. It's thinking about, maybe using some different kind of project management methodologies as you're constructing this. Thinking about this, do you want to take an agile approach? Do you want to take a waterfall approach? How do you want to do this? And I think there are a lot of lessons, absolutely from SOTL here, but I also think there are a lot of lessons from things like product design, UX design, I think, and design thinking. I think that those can be some quite powerful tools for when you're putting it. I always feel like the technology isn't important, but it's not everything piece of this. Actually, a lot of this is really kind of good, kind of like a research project, and kind of manage it accordingly. And sorry, go ahead, Liz.
Sorry, I was just going to say too, Ruth, to you, I'd want to know, what does audio illustrate that something else can't? So I'm thinking about that comment that Siobhan made about the baby and that podcast, the pediatrics and the baby. Is there something that you think the audience, as Erica says, so true, they need to hear, rather than just read? You know what I mean? Is there something that can be demonstrated through their ears? And it could also be the absence. It's letting silence sit, or letting them be uncomfortable. It's also time-based as well. You know what I mean? Reading, we can skip. I know that we can kind of speed through podcasts, but it's time-based. So do you want them to engage with things in a particular order? And is that something you're thinking about? But I'd listen, let us know.
Wonderful, thank you. So I want to thank Liz, Erica and Jess and Joe for our thinking session.